My husband dumped me and told everyone at his birthday party, "She's so boring, even her tears are predictable." He didn't know I had been quietly building a podcast empire that reached 5 million listeners. 2 years later, he showed up at my live event, crying for a shout-out. What happened on stage made him regret ever leaving. I met Bryce in the fall of 2013. We were both at McNally Jackson Bookstore in Soho, reaching for the same copy of Slouching Towards Bethlehem. I remember his laugh, this quiet, thoughtful sound that made me think of jazz clubs and smart documentaries. He wore a scarf like he meant it. He was magnetic in that curated, downtown New York kind of way. I was 28 then. A little lost. Still clinging to my dream of being a full-time writer, working odd jobs, and filling notebooks with half-baked essays no one ever read. Bryce was 5 years older, already established in advertising. Confident. Smooth. He talked about clients and campaigns like they were art. And I listened, too much. We moved in together fast. A brownstone in Park Slope, 2 floors, a tiny backyard, creaky wood floors. We bought used furniture and threw dinner parties where he played the role of charming host, while I smiled and refilled glasses. People liked him. He was easy to like. But being around him was like standing next to a lighthouse, bright, attention-catching, but far too distant to hold. I shrunk slowly. Over the years, my voice softened. My dreams dimmed. I got a job editing copy for a mid-tier lifestyle blog. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills. I wrote on the side, but I didn't share much. Bryce would skim what I wrote and say, "It's fine." Never cruel. Just disinterested. He liked things simple. Controlled. Curated. I was none of those things. The real shift came during the pandemic. We were locked in, and Bryce hated the lack of external validation. No more networking events, no spontaneous after-work drinks, no admirers to feed his ego. He grew restless. Annoyed. He mocked my sourdough starter. Called it desperate Pinterest energy. One night, after too much wine and one too many lectures about my lack of drive, I downloaded a free audio editor and started recording into an old mic I had lying around. I didn't know what I was doing at first. I just needed to hear my own voice again. So I talked. About loneliness. About quiet mornings. About losing pieces of yourself in the name of love. I called it the still space. No intro music. No production. Just my voice and the stories I collected from people on Reddit, Facebook groups, and later, emails from listeners who stumbled across my early uploads. Bryce never asked. He assumed I was doom-scrolling or watching reality TV. He didn't care enough to wonder. The podcast started slow. Maybe a dozen downloads in the first week. Then, 50. Then, a few hundred. A woman from Iowa messaged me saying my voice reminded her of her late sister. A man from Glasgow said one of my episodes gave him the courage to call his estranged son. I cried quietly in our bathroom reading those messages. Because I wasn't invisible anymore. But I said nothing to Bryce. He wouldn't understand. Fast forward to his birthday. Spring 2022. He threw a party for himself at this rooftop bar in Tribeca, one of those places with $22 member tails and decorative moss on the walls. Everyone was there. His colleagues, old college friends, even a girl he used to date and now claimed was just a friend. I had curled my hair. Worn the dress he once said he liked. I stood beside him smiling, holding his jacket, making small talk. Then he got up to make a speech. Glass in hand, swaying just slightly. Drunk on whiskey and his own charisma. "I just want to say," he began, pausing for effect, "life is short. Surround yourself with people who make you laugh. Who surprise you." Then he turned to me and grinned. "And not people who cry the same way every time. I mean, she's so boring, even her tears are predictable." Laughter. I stood there. Frozen. My ears buzzing. No one defended me. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just left. Walked 3 blocks to the nearest subway. Rode home alone. That night, I slept in the guest room. 2 weeks later, I filed for divorce. He was shocked. Said I was blowing things out of proportion. Told our friends I was emotionally unstable. But I was already gone. I stayed in the apartment until the lease ended. Used the time to double down on my podcast. I interviewed a hospice nurse from Vermont. A former cult member from Colorado. A man who forgave the driver who slaughtered his wife. The stories were raw. Real. Beautiful. Listeners poured in. Spotify emailed me in November 2022 with a licensing offer. My inbox became a flood of guest requests, partnership deals, and personal letters. I left Brooklyn in January 2023. Moved to a quiet loft in Astoria. Set up a small studio with velvet curtains and a second-hand velvet couch for in-person interviews. By summer, I had 5 million downloads. Then came the live shows. Boston. Philly. Denver. Seattle. Crowds full of people who brought tissues and hugged me like we'd known each other for years. They didn't care that I wasn't flashy. That I wasn't polished. They came because they felt seen. And then came Atlanta. The night that changed everything. The Fox Theater was packed. Every seat filled. The kind of crowd that made your chest tight when you looked out from backstage. I still remember standing there, holding my notes, heart pounding like I was about to take a school exam I hadn't studied for. But this wasn't school. This was my life. My voice. My people. The audience was quiet as the lights dimmed. Then the music played, subtle, warm, the opening chords to the theme I'd picked out nearly 2 years ago in my closet, thinking no one but me would ever hear it. I stepped on stage. The applause was like a wave. Loud. Real. People cheering, clapping, standing. I wasn't used to that kind of reception. I'd spent most of my adult life blending into the background, trying not to take up too much space. But in that moment, I felt taller than I ever had before. The night was going smoothly. I interviewed a woman named Patrice who shared her story about rebuilding her life after leaving a 26-year marriage. Her ex had drained their finances behind her back. She walked away with almost nothing but found joy again by starting a community garden in her neighborhood. People were in tears. You could feel the room breathing with every word she spoke. Then came the audience Q&A. We had 2 standing mics placed in the aisles. A few people asked about writing, some shared how certain episodes helped them through loss or divorce. A young woman said she'd been listening since her mom passed and that my voice had become part of her grief ritual. I had to pause, my throat tightening. That's when I saw him. Standing in line at the left mic, second in line. Bryce. He looked older. Leaner, maybe, or just worn. Same haircut, same pretentious glasses, but without the sparkle. He was shifting on his feet like he wasn't sure if he should stay or run. I thought maybe I was seeing things. But then he looked straight at me. There was no mistaking it. And there he was, waiting like any other person. Not a VIP. Not backstage. Just another face in the crowd. I kept going. Tried to focus. A woman asked what advice I had for someone going through the early days of separation. I answered honestly. Told her that heartbreak feels like a death, but grief doesn't mean you did something wrong, it just means you dared to care. The room nodded, murmured, cried quietly. It was everything I loved about these shows. Raw. Unscripted. Honest. Then it was Bryce's turn. He walked to the mic, cleared his throat. The room shifted. You could feel it, the collective change in energy. Some of my longtime listeners must have recognized him from old stories, maybe pieced it together. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. I just wanted to say, he started, that watching this tonight, seeing what you've built, it's overwhelming. I didn't know. His voice cracked a little. He forced a laugh. You used to talk about stories like they were living things. I never really got it. But hearing people talk about how you've changed their lives, it made me realize how little I saw of you. Back then. There was silence. He looked down at the mic, then back up. I don't expect anything. I'm not here to cause a scene. I just wanted to ask if you'd give me a shout out or something. He chuckled weakly. Maybe just a nod. For old time's sake. It was surreal. This man, who once stood at a rooftop bar and mocked me to a room full of people I used to try so hard to impress, was now standing in a theater filled with strangers who knew the version of me he never bothered to meet. I let the moment breathe. The room waited. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage and looked at him, not with anger, but with something colder. Indifference. My voice didn't shake. You once said I was boring, I said, that even my tears were predictable. There was a soft gasp from the crowd. Someone whispered, damn. I kept going. I've cried with thousands of people since then. And not once has it ever felt boring. Or predictable. The applause was immediate. Loud. Cathartic. Like the entire room had been holding their breath with me. Bryce stepped back, nodding slowly. He didn't say anything else. Just sat down in his seat, hands in his lap. I turned back to the audience. And tonight, I said, let's not give a shout out to someone who once left us behind. Let's give one to the version of ourselves we stayed loyal to, even when no one else saw her. They stood. All of them. The ovation went on for over a minute. I blinked fast to keep my lashes dry. Later, after the show, I stayed to sign programs, take photos, and hug strangers who no longer felt like strangers. Bryce waited near the back of the venue. I saw him once, leaning against a wall, watching. He didn't approach me again. Just stood there, then quietly walked out. And you know what? I didn't follow. He had his moment. But this was mine. I got back to my hotel that night and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, still in my stage clothes, still wearing the heels that had started to pinch somewhere around the second segment. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by this quiet hum of something else. Not sadness. Not joy either. Just a calm, like the ocean after a storm. My phone had exploded, of course. Messages from friends, old colleagues, listeners who'd recognized the moment for what it was, an unexpected reckoning. Screenshots of Bryce at the mic were already circulating in a few podcast fan groups. A clip someone recorded had gone semi-viral on TikTok within hours. But I didn't watch any of it. Not that night. Instead, I pulled up my voice notes and recorded a reflection for the next episode. No edits. No retakes. Just my voice, raw and tired but steady. I used to think the worst thing someone could do was leave you, I said. But I've learned that the worst thing, truly, is to be unseen. To be erased quietly, day by day, by someone who claims to love you. That kind of leaving, it happens while you're still sitting across from them at dinner. And then I turned off the lights. The following morning, I boarded a plane to San Francisco for the next show. I was sipping burnt coffee in the Delta Lounge when I got a text from Lorelei, my sister. It just said, Bryce reached out. Should I block him or you want to know what he said? I stared at the screen for a full minute. He and Lorelei had never gotten along. She saw through him from the beginning, said he treated me like a project he never intended to finish. They'd only tolerated each other for my sake. I replied, what did he say? She sent a screenshot. It was a long message. He'd apparently DM'd her on Instagram at 2 a.m. the night of the Atlanta show. The message was rambling, apologetic, self-pitying. He said watching me on stage made him realize he had wasted something extraordinary. That he always believed she was meant for more, but was too afraid to admit it. He ended the message with, Please tell her I'm proud of her. And that I miss her. Not because I need her. But because the world seems quieter without her in it. Quieter. The irony. I didn't respond to him. I didn't tell Lorelai to block him either. I just let it sit there, floating in the digital ether like a balloon with no one holding the string. The San Francisco show was just as beautiful as Atlanta. Different city, different stories, same sacred energy. I met a woman in her 70s who'd started listening during chemotherapy. She told me my podcast kept her company through every infusion. Said she pictured us sitting in her living room, sipping tea, even though she knew we'd never met. I haven't felt seen in years, she whispered, holding my hand. Not since my husband passed. But when I listen to you, I feel like I matter again. And that's when I realized, none of this was ever about Bryce. It was never about proving him wrong. It was about proving myself right. That the stories we tell, the quiet ones, the raw ones, the ones we hide in the back of our minds, they're worth something. Even when no one's clapping. Even when they don't go viral. Even when the people closest to us don't listen. Especially then. A few weeks later, I flew home to New York. My little loft in Astoria still smelled faintly like sandalwood and old books. My plants were alive. My inbox was flooded. I sat down at my desk and saw a letter in the mail stack. Handwritten. No return address. It was from Bryce. A real letter. Not an email. Not a text. His handwriting was the same as always. Clean, controlled, too neat to ever reveal emotion. It wasn't long. Just one page. In it, he said he'd been listening to the podcast. That he didn't start until after Atlanta, but once he did, he couldn't stop. Said he'd gone back to episode 1. That he couldn't believe I had built it all under the same roof he'd walked around in for years, completely unaware. I missed everything, he wrote. Because I was too busy trying to be seen to ever stop and see you. He said he wasn't writing to ask for anything. Just to say sorry. Truly. And then, in one final line at the bottom, I used to think your silence meant you had nothing to say. Now I realize it was just the only space I left you. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't move me, but because I had already grieved. Already buried that part of myself. Already built a life out of the pieces. I kept the letter. Tucked it into a folder I labeled not forgotten. Not needed. And then I went back to work. Summer rolled in fast, the kind of humid, heavy summer New York is famous for, the air like syrup, the sidewalks radiating heat. My studio was a safe little bubble away from all of it. Velvet curtains drawn, a soft hum from the AC, the gentle soundproofing turning the noise of the city into a distant heartbeat. That summer was when everything shifted again, not dramatically, not with fireworks, but in the slow and steady way a glacier changes a landscape. Subtle at first, until you look around one day and realize nothing is where it used to be. I was now doing 2 live shows a month. Full theaters. Standing ovations. Emails every day from listeners pouring out their lives in paragraphs. But I still kept the same routine, morning tea, research, editing. I didn't hire a big team. I didn't change the format. I just kept doing the thing that saved me. One night, I got a message from a woman named Denise from Rochester. She said her daughter had died by suicide and that my episode on loss had been the first time she'd felt anything in months. She signed it, "You gave me a reason to sit in the kitchen again." I recorded her story the following week. She sat across from me, hands trembling slightly as she spoke, but her voice never wavered. She described grief like water, sometimes crashing, sometimes still, but always there. I didn't cry during the interview. I waited until after. When she left, I closed the studio door and just sat in the chair, holding the silence like it was fragile glass. Because there are moments in this work where the weight of other people's pain sits next to your own, and it feels like a shared language. One I never could speak when I was with Bryce. A few days after that interview aired, I got another letter. Not from him this time, but from his mother. Her handwriting was less polished, loopier, softer. She'd always liked me. Sent handwritten cards on our anniversaries, bought me a cookbook one Christmas with a note that said, "Because Bryce will never learn to cook, but you make a mean stew." The letter wasn't long. She said she'd heard what happened in Atlanta. That Bryce had told her everything. That she'd started listening to the podcast and wanted me to know she was proud of me, even if she wasn't allowed to say it out loud at Sunday dinners. She wrote, "He doesn't understand how to be small. He only knows how to shine, not how to share the light." And then, you didn't just survive him. You built a cathedral out of the rubble. I stared at that line for a long time. It felt like something cracking open inside me, validation I hadn't needed, but still meant something. Not because it came from someone connected to him, but because it reminded me of who I had been all along, someone worth listening to. Even if it took the world a while to tune in. That summer, I also met someone. Not romantically, not in the way stories usually go, but someone important. Her name was Mira. She was a poet who had gone viral during the protests of 2020. She had this deep, melodic voice and a way of speaking that made even the air lean in. We were on the same panel at a literary event and ended up having dinner afterward. No pretense. No performance. Just conversation. She asked me how I got started, and I told her everything. The closet recordings. The hidden files. The party. The silence. She looked at me and said, "You know that silence was never empty, right? It was just waiting." We started collaborating a few months later, special episodes blending poetry and narrative. It brought in a whole new wave of listeners. We even did a joint tour that fall, The Unheard Speak. It was the first time I shared the stage with someone. And I didn't shrink. I didn't hide. And not once did I think about what Bryce would have said. Well, almost not once. Because the truth is, ghosts don't disappear. They just change shape. Sometimes they show up in a voice note you find on your old phone. Sometimes in the background of a friend's Instagram post. Sometimes in a dream where you're back at that rooftop bar, hearing the laugh track to your humiliation echo like sirens. I still thought of him. Not longingly. Not angrily either. Just thoughtfully. Like a chapter one reread sometimes, not because I miss it, but because I need to remember the plot. One afternoon, about a year after Atlanta, I got an invitation. It was for an alumni event at his old firm. A panel on branding in a human age. He was listed as one of the speakers. So was I. My stomach dropped when I saw it. Not because I was scared, but because part of me had already filed him away, like a book closed and shelved. I called the event organizer. Asked if they were aware of the overlap. They were. Apparently, it was intentional. "People think it would make for an interesting juxtaposition," she said. "You're both storytellers. Just from different angles." I almost said no. But then I remembered something Mira told me, sometimes, showing up isn't about them. It's about proving to yourself that you don't owe your past the silence it demanded. So I said yes. The alumni event was held at a glossy glass-walled hotel in Midtown, one of those places with cold lighting, overpriced espresso, and an air of performative importance. Everything looked expensive and smelled like cologne marketed to men who called themselves thought leaders. I wore a navy jumpsuit. Sleek, minimal. The kind of outfit I never would have worn when I was with him, too bold, too modern, too much look at me. But that was the point. They seated me at a table with two other panelists, a digital strategist and a best-selling author. Bryce wasn't there yet. I asked where the speaker's lounge was and went to grab tea, pretending I wasn't timing my exit perfectly to avoid bumping into him. The event began with a welcome speech, followed by a panel on authenticity in branding. I noticed people stealing glances at me throughout, some smiling in recognition. A few came up and said they'd been listeners since the closet mic days. That phrase made me beam every time. Then it was our turn, the headline panel, narrative power, telling stories that last. We were introduced in alphabetical order. Bryce was listed first. He walked onto the stage with the same overconfident stride I remembered, shoulders back, jaw clenched just enough to look intentional. But there was something different now. The brightness wasn't effortless anymore. It looked forced. I followed him onto the stage, not looking at him. We took our seats. The host gave a brief background on each of us. Bryce Maddox, creative director at Polaris and architect of over 20 major brand campaigns. And he turned to me. Aurelia Knox, creator and host of The Still Space, which now reaches over 5 million listeners globally and was recently adapted into a limited series by Hulu. There was a short applause. Polite, but present. Bryce turned just slightly in my direction. I didn't meet his eyes. The moderator asked us to open by answering a simple question: what makes a story memorable? Bryce jumped in first. Polished. Relatability. Simplicity. Structure, he said. You have to take the audience somewhere they recognize. I waited, then leaned toward the mic. Stories become memorable when you stop trying to control them, I said. When you tell the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, even if no one claps at the end. There was a beat of silence. A couple of heads nodded. One person clapped quietly. The questions kept coming. I kept answering honestly. I wasn't performative. I didn't try to win. But the audience started shifting, slowly at first. You could feel it. They leaned in when I spoke. Laughed when I shared small self-deprecating stories. Some people started taking notes. Bryce interrupted me once. Tried to reframe something I said as inspirational, but idealistic. I just smiled. Sometimes, idealism is just honesty that hasn't been crushed yet, I replied. The room chuckled. By the end of the panel, it was clear who'd left the bigger mark. After the session, there was a mixer in the lounge. I tried to make my way to the door without stopping too much, but people kept approaching. A woman in her 50s thanked me for saying what she'd been trying to teach her students about vulnerability. A young man said his mom had introduced him to my podcast during a rough patch, and it helped them talk again. As I moved toward the elevator, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Bryce. Can we talk? Just 5 minutes, he asked. I paused, then nodded. 5. We stepped into a quieter hallway by a row of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. He sighed. You're incredible up there. Thanks. I didn't realize. I mean, I always knew you were thoughtful. But what you've built? I had no idea. You didn't want to, I said, not bitter, just factually. It didn't serve your narrative. He winced, nodding slowly. I deserved that. There was a long pause. I think about that birthday party all the time, he added. The look on your face. God, I was you were cruel, I finished. Not just that night. 4 years. You didn't yell. You didn't cheat. But you made me invisible. That's a different kind of violence. And it takes longer to name. He looked like he'd been slapped. I'm sorry, Aurelia. I know you don't owe me anything, but I needed to say it out loud. You did. And now you have. Another pause. Is there any part of you that misses what we had? He asked, eyes searching. I looked at him, not with hate, not with longing. Just clarity. I don't miss being small. He swallowed hard, then gave a sad little nod. You know, people think I was the star in our story. They did, I said. But stars fade. Voices carry. He didn't have a response to that. Just stood there, blinking. Then came the final, quiet dagger. Oh, by the way, I said, walking backward toward the elevator, Hulu offered me final script approval. The pilot's based on that night. The rooftop. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I gave you a different name, though, I smiled. Don't worry. No one will know. Except, you. The elevator dinged. I stepped inside. He stayed in the hallway, frozen. Just a man watching the story walk away. That night, I celebrated with Mira and 2 other friends on the rooftop of my apartment building in Astoria. We drank cheap rose and laughed until we cried. No revenge. No destruction. No chaos. Just peace.